My name is Matt Galzo. I'm the Director of the Resilience and Economics Integration Division at Public Safety Canada. For those of you who may not be familiar with my organization, we're the domestic lead for safety and security in Canada. Within public safety, I work specifically in the emergency management branch on disaster risk reduction related activities. And what I'd like to do today is just very briefly tell you about some of our experience in working with the Geological Survey of Canada in the domain of disaster risk assessment, and specifically about our experience in attempting to strengthen and to cross the science policy divide, and really attempting to mobilize some of the foundational research that was done by the Geological Survey when we needed it most. Before getting into how we attempted to cross that science policy divide, I thought a bit of context might be useful. In terms of disasters in Canada, before the mid-1990s, only 3 disasters in Canadian history had exceeded $500 million in adjusted disaster losses. And then with flooding events in 1996 and 1997 and an ice storm on the eastern seaboard in 1998, we had 3 disasters right in a row, all exceeding that $500 million threshold. And that seemed to have marked a fundamental tipping point in our disaster risk profile, because every year since then we've had on average at least one $500 million disaster, and in fact over the course of the last decade at least $1 billion disaster on average every single year. So this is a trend that we see increasing fairly massively, and we did start to recognize that we were in the midst of this trend sometime in the late 2000s. And so part of the work that we had been doing at that point was attempting to quantify and better understand our disaster risk across the country. And at that time, the only metrics that we had access to federally were through our disaster assistance program. And that program cost the federal government on average from 1970 to that tipping point in our risk profile in the mid 1990s, about $50 million per year on average. In the decade beginning in the mid-1990s, it jumped to $291 million per year on average. In the decade beginning in the mid-2000s, it jumped to over $400 million per year. It jumped again in the 2010s to over $600 million per year, and we're on the hook now just for previous events for an additional $1 billion or so for the next 5 years, assuming that there are no other disaster events. So this obviously got significant attention within the provinces and local governments as well as at the federal level. So there was a lot of soul searching that took place around 2010 in an attempt to figure out how we could better deal with these increasing costs and increasing impacts from disasters across the country. As we were understanding where we were on that curve of disaster impact increases, I think many countries around the world had a similar revelation. And that led to a lot of changes coming out of the United Nations Hyogo framework for disaster risk reduction. And one of those changes that we paid particularly close attention to was the role that risk assessments and evidence and governance played in exacerbating disaster vulnerability and increasing resilience. Because of that, we really started to pay particular attention both to what the existing evidence said about risk and vulnerability and resilience across the country, and also how that was informing decision making at the federal level with our provinces and territories and with our local governments. And that really led us into a bit of an inventorying process through which we found this great hub of scientific expertise in the Geological Survey of Canada. And so we very quickly started to form collaborative relationships with the Geological Survey in an attempt to standardize or advance and standardize risk and resilience assessment methodologies across the country, and not only figure out how to make that standardization, that commonality, to develop a common picture of risk and resilience across the country, but also to ensure that beyond just the critical risk awareness, we were moving into some kind of actionable intelligence that decision makers could take action upon and make decisions with, so that we could come to terms with the role that public policy was playing in driving disaster impacts. A collaborative relationship was initiated between Public Safety Canada and the Geological Survey. And over the course of a decade, a suite of different projects across Canada were launched to do various parts of risk assessment and resilience assessment methodological development. And to be honest, there were times where there was misalignment between what the Geological Survey was able to do in terms of their mandate and what the desires were from Public Safety Canada in terms of our mandate. So there was a good deal of negotiation across organizations as we sought to build this foundational evidence and these foundational methodological approaches to deal with risk assessments across the country. And also to try to standardize these approaches so that we might be able to get a clear picture of risk across multiple perils, across each province and territory, and also at the federal level. So as I just alluded to, there were certainly some challenges in attempting to line up the mandates of the Geological Survey with what was required from Public Safety Canada. And I think for the better part of the decade that we had been collaborating in the risk assessment space, we really didn't know what we were sitting on in terms of advances in knowledge and science and risk assessment. And I don't think that it became obvious, at least to us on Public Safety Canada's side, just how far we had come until a tasking was issued from the Prime Minister to the Minister of Emergency Preparedness to stand up a residential flood insurance market for Canada. As it turns out, if you mostly develop your country by canoe, almost all of your major cities are wholly or partially located in floodplains. And as a result, flood risk in Canada is quite severe. However, because of the geography of the country and the how dispersed the population is, we had never had full national coverage for flood mapping. But when this mandate commitment was issued, we worked very quickly working off of the foundational research that had been developed in the risk assessment space, along with some advances in catastrophe modeling, both from the scientific and academic sector, as well as from international catastrophe modeling firms and reinsurance organizations, to pull together the most comprehensive damage assessment for flooding that had ever been done in Canada, which included not just residential infrastructure and specifics about where the water was going to go, but also significant inputs about marginalization and vulnerability in our populations, which again was just a perspective that we had not been able to bring to the policy decision-making space until very recently. And it was really only because of that 10 years of investment and those incremental projects, some of which went exactly the way we wanted to, and some of which I don't think quite did, but it was only because of that investment in time and in that relationship that we were able to, in very short order, pull what we pulled together in support of this National Flood Insurance mandate commitment. Because we were able to pull on the latent potential in the scientific domain on risk assessment from the Geological Survey, we've been reflecting a little bit on what some of our observations were and how we would maybe do things the same or different in the next decade. And so just a few observations and lessons learned came to mind that I'll just share with you very, very briefly. The first one is that the science to policy process takes time. And in our case, it was over 10 years of sustained engagement, and it really wasn't until all of the cards were put on the table and we realized that we needed to move so aggressively on something with a very high level of political profile that we knew what a great investment that had been. So sustaining the engagement was a really important step for us. The next point that builds off of that is I think that it's important to recognize that not all research and development initiatives will be successful, nor will they necessarily contribute to bridging that science to policy divide, but perseverance is required. Over time, even when projects don't go the way that you necessarily want them to, they are always contributing important pieces to the knowledge puzzle that does get us into this space where we're able to very rapidly draw upon those developments and apply it into the policy space. The third piece is that crossover personalities are required on both sides of the science policy divide. So that means, in our experience, it was very important to have technical experts on the scientific side who were working with an eye towards public policy decision making, and at the same time that we had public policy decision makers with sufficient scientific literacy that they were really able to understand and deploy the science when it was called upon. I think in addition to having those crossover personalities need to meet. They need to make the connections to build the trust that's required to fully exploit the potential that is built up through the policy relevant research that was conducted by the Geological Survey in our case. And then finally, you heard it already, but when collaborative efforts like this, where you make such long-term investments pay off, I think they pay off in really big and important ways. And so we certainly really do appreciate the collaborative work that we have been doing with the Geological Survey over the course of the last 13 years now. And we're looking very much forward to what the next decade has in store. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and happy to engage more on our experience during the question and answer period.